Not all space missions are listed on the NASA's website. When most people think of space exploration, they imagine science, telescopes, rovers, moon landings, shiny logos from NASA or ESA. But there is another side of space. One that doesn't show up in press conferences, one that doesn't release photos, one that operates above our heads but far below the radar. Because from the very beginning, space has never been just about discovery. It's also been about control. Control of orbits, control of information, control of the high ground. And not every mission in space is designed for science. Some are launched quietly under the cover of vague government statements. Some are disguised entirely, presented as weather satellites or technology demonstrators when they really something else. And some missions are never acknowledged at all. During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union used space to spy on each other with incredible precision and complete secrecy. Today, multiple nations operate satellites with classified purposes, conducting operations that no civilian agency is allowed to talk about. And it's not just about surveillance. From space planes with unclear missions to orbital weapons that might already exist, to old programs that were only revealed decades later. Space has quietly become one of the most militarized and most secretive frontiers we've ever entered. So today we are going to lift the curtain. We'll look at space missions that weren't designed to inspire the public, but to hide from it. Missions that collected data, tracked enemies, or tested systems too sensitive to name. Some of them have been declassified. Some are still shrouded in silence. But they all raise one unsettling question. What else is going on up there that we are not supposed to know about? Before Hubble, before James Webb, before Starlink, there was Corona. No, not the virus and not the beer. Corona was the code name for the United States' first successful spy satellite program, launched at the height of the Cold War and kept completely secret for decades. Officially, these satellites were part of a project called Discoverer. They were supposed to be scientific missions, studying space, testing re-entry systems, gathering data. That was the cover story. In reality, Discoverer was a front, and Corona was the operation running behind it. Starting in 1960, the US began launching satellites that could photograph the Soviet Union from orbit. These early Corona satellites carried actual film cameras, massive rolls of black and white film, pointed down at Earth from over 100 miles above. The images weren't transmitted digitally. This was the 1960s. Instead, the film was loaded into re-entry capsules, tiny space canisters that were ejected from the satellite, fell back to Earth, and were literally caught mid-air by US Air Force planes with giant nets. Yes, that really happened. The Corona program captured millions of images. It revealed missile silos, troop movements, airfields, and nuclear testing facilities deep inside Soviet territory. Intelligence that shaped American strategy for years. But publicly, these missions didn't exist. The entire program remained classified until 1995, when President Clinton ordered its declassification. Suddenly, we had access to a treasure trove of historical imagery, not just useful for defense analysts, but for scientists studying glaciers, urban growth, even ancient ruins. Corona was the proof of concept, that you could see from space. That orbit could be weaponized, not with bombs, but with information. It was the moment space became strategic. And it set the tone for everything that came next. The idea that not all space missions would be done in the name of exploration. Some would be launched in silence, and their targets weren't stars. They were aiming for Earth. If you think the US was the only country hiding things in the orbit, think again. The Soviet Union's space program was famous for its big public wins: Sputnik, Gagarin, Luna, a string of firsts that made headlines around the world. But behind the pegging tree was something else. Something secret. Because the Soviets didn't just compete with NASA, they had their own classified programs. Missions the public never knew about. Records that were altered, erased, or never kept at all. Let's start with the rumors. Throughout the 1960s, radio operators in Italy claimed to intercept strange, unacknowledged transmissions coming from space. Voices in Russian, cries for help, signals that didn't match any official mission. They believed they were hearing lost cosmonauts, test pilots launched into space before Gagarin, who never returned and whose deaths were covered up. The Soviet Union denied it. To this day, there is no hard proof. But it speaks to a deeper truth. For decades, not every Soviet launch was reported, and not every failure was admitted. Then there is the Almaz program, a series of top-secret Soviet space stations launched in the 1970s. While NASA was putting Skylab into orbit, the Soviets were launching what they claimed were civilian science stations under the name Salyut. But some of those Salyut stations weren't civilian at all. They were military, and they were armed. The Almaz stations were equipped with high-resolution telescopes to watch Earth, not the stars. And incredibly, one even carried a 23mm space cannon. Yes, a real gun, in space. In 1975, the crew of Salyut 3 reportedly test-fired the cannon, the only time a weapon has ever been discharged in orbit. Why? To test whether a space station could defend itself from enemy satellites. Almaz were eventually scrapped, but it set a precedent. The idea that space wasn't just for science, it could also be a theater for defense. The Soviet Union collapsed before its full plans could play out. But the blueprint was clear. Orbit wasn't neutral. And some missions would never make the news. Even today, Russia's modern space program operates with far less transparency than NASA or ESA. Some launches are announced with no listed payload. Others are omitted entirely, and the question lingers: how much of what went up there never came back down? Okay, this one is a heavy one. It looks like something out of science fiction. A miniature space shuttle, no windows, no pilot, just a slick white vehicle orbiting silently above the Earth. Its name? X-37B. And unless you follow space news very closely, you've probably never heard of it. The X-37B is an uncrewed orbital spaceplane operated by the United States Space Force. It launches like a rocket, orbits the Earth for months, sometimes over a year, and then lands on a runway like a traditional aircraft. But here's the catch. We don't know exactly what it does up there. The X-37B's missions are classified. Its cargo bay is closed. Its flight paths are somewhat public, but its objectives not so much. Since its first flight in 2010, the spaceplane has launched 6 times. Its longest mission lasted 908 days. That's almost 2.5 years in orbit without a single human aboard. Officially, the US military says it's testing reusable space technologies, sensors, navigation systems, and satellite hardware. That may be true, but it doesn't explain the secrecy, or the extreme duration, or why this program is housed under the Space Force rather than NASA. Some observers have speculated that it's testing reconnaissance equipment. Others believe it could be capable of deploying small satellites, retrieving them, or even, in theory, disabling others. And a few theories go further, suggesting it may be part of an experimental space weapons platform. There is no confirmed evidence of any of that. But the secrecy surrounding the X-37B leaves plenty of room for speculation. Here is what we do know. It works, it's highly reliable, and it's unlike anything else in the world's current orbital fleet. The X-37B represents a new kind of space mission, not built for public outreach or science headlines, but for tactical advantage. It's fast, quiet, reusable, and still, over a decade later, we are not entirely sure what it's up to. Which might be the whole point, because in the silence of space, the loudest message is the one you don't send. For decades, space was seen as a neutral ground, a place for science, for diplomacy, for reaching beyond Earth, not fighting over it. In 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed, a landmark agreement declaring that space would be used for peaceful purposes. No nuclear weapons, no national claims on the moon, no military bases in orbit. But treaties are one thing, reality is another. Because while the world promised not to weaponize space, it's been quietly doing exactly that. Let's start with the basics. Today, dozens of nations operate military satellites for communication, GPS, early warning, and surveillance. That's not speculation, that's a fact. But over the last 2 decades, things have escalated. In 2007, China launched a missile and destroyed one of its own weather satellites, an anti-satellite test that left behind thousands of pieces of debris. The US followed suit in 2008, destroying a defunct spy satellite with a ship-launched missile. India joined in 2019 with its own ASAT test. Each time, the official explanation was safety or defense or orbital cleanup. But the message was clear. Satellites, the invisible infrastructure behind our phones, GPS, banking, and internet, are vulnerable, and some nations are now developing systems to target them. We are talking about kinetic kill vehicles, which are satellites that slam into others at high speed, co-orbital stalkers that shadow others in space, able to disable or blind, directed energy weapons, ground-based lasers designed to dazzle imaging satellites, and electronic warfare systems, capable of jamming, spoofing, or disabling space-based communication. There are even proposals, some serious, some theoretical, for space-based weapons, like the infamous rods from God. Massive tungsten rods dropped from orbit to strike targets with the force of a nuclear bomb minus the fallout. None of these weapons have been confirmed to be deployed. But the technology exists, the capability exists, and the mistrust, that definitely exists too. Because as more nations and private companies enter space, the question of who controls it and who defends it becomes harder to ignore. Space may be vast, but the orbit is crowded, and conflict, once theoretical, is slowly becoming tactical. The battlefield isn't coming, it's already there. When we think of space, we picture wonder. Telescopes peering into distant galaxies, rovers exploring alien worlds, astronauts floating weightless above a glowing Earth. But space always had two faces. One looks outward, towards science, discovery, and inspiration. The other looks downward, towards strategy, surveillance, and control. And while we celebrate the missions that make headlines, some of the most active spacecraft in orbit have no logos, no live streams, and no press kits. They are launched at night, tracked by hobbyists, and followed only in silence. That's not science fiction, this is history. It started with Corona, cameras disguised as weather research. It continued with Almaz, a space station armed with a gun. It evolved into X-37B, the orbital vehicle with no stated mission. And it continues today with satellites that nudge, track, and jam each other in the dark. Space is no longer just a frontier. It's a domain, like air, sea, or cyberspace. One where national interests are quietly competing. And yet, most people still think space is peaceful. But maybe that's by design. Because in the high orbit above us, not every signal is public, not every launch is for science, and not every satellite is watching the stars. Some are watching us. Some are watching each other. And some are simply watching without being seen. So what else is happening in the orbit? What programs will be declassified in 20 years that sound impossible today? We don't know. And that's the point. Because some space exploration isn't just about what we discover, sometimes it's about what we choose not to say. So here is the question I leave you with. What do you think is still happening above our heads that we are not supposed to know about? Let us know in the comments. And if you are drawn to hidden side of space, the missions you've never heard of, and stories no one's telling, subscribe. Thank you for watching. Keep looking up.